Okay, so here's what actually happened in the last 48 hours that should have every single Canadian absolutely furious right now, and every single American deeply concerned about what their government is doing in their name. The Trump administration just pulled the trigger on something that most trade experts thought was completely off the table, something that violates every principle of international trade law, something that trade lawyers on both sides of the political spectrum are calling legally indefensible, and something that is going to fundamentally reshape the relationship between the United States and Canada for generations to come. Let me break down exactly what Section 301 means, because the mainstream media in the United States is barely covering this story. And when they do cover it, they are catastrophically underselling how serious this decision actually is. Section 301 is a provision in U.S. trade law that allows the president to unilaterally investigate and retaliate against what he personally deems to be unfair trade practices by foreign countries. Unilaterally, without Congress, without international arbitration, without any checks and balances whatsoever, the president decides, the president acts, and everyone else lives with the consequences. Trump just invoked Section 301 against Canada. America's closest ally, largest trading partner, and the country that shares the longest undefended border in the world with the United States. The investigation targets Canadian digital services taxes, Canadian dairy policies, and Canadian environmental regulations that the Trump administration claims discriminate against American businesses. And the investigation alone, before a single additional tariff is actually imposed, gives Trump the legal authority to slap tariffs of up to 60% on virtually any Canadian export he chooses. 60% on lumber, on aluminum, on automobiles, on energy, on pharmaceuticals, on every single thing Canada sends across that border. But here's the part that should make your blood boil. The Trump administration didn't just announce this investigation quietly and let the process play out. They coordinated it with a series of executive actions that froze certain Canadian assets held in American financial institutions, suspended visa processing for Canadian business travelers operating in specific sectors, and threatened to revoke the security clearances of American companies doing business with what they're calling non-compliant Canadian firms. Do you understand what that means? This is not a trade dispute. This is not a policy disagreement between two friendly nations trying to find a better arrangement. This is economic warfare. Deliberate, coordinated, targeted economic warfare against the country that has been America's most reliable partner for over a century. Now, let me tell you about the single biggest miscalculation the Trump administration made when they decided to pick this fight, because it starts with Mark Carney. Everyone in Washington assumed that because Carney came from the world of central banking, the Bank of Canada and then the Bank of England, he would be cautious, measured, stability-obsessed, and would prioritize preserving the relationship with America above almost any other consideration. They thought he was a technocrat, a numbers guy, someone who understood that economic disruption is bad and would therefore avoid it at almost any cost. They thought he would look at the situation, calculate the risks, and find a face-saving way to give Trump enough of what he wanted to make the problem go away. They were wrong. Catastrophically, embarrassingly, historically wrong. Within 6 hours of Trump's Section 301 announcement, Carney was on national television, not at a press conference, not through a carefully worded statement from a spokesperson. He was on camera looking directly at the Canadian people, and he said something that no Canadian Prime Minister has said to an American president in living memory. He said, "Canada will not be bullied, Canada will not be threatened, and Canada will not allow a reckless American administration to destroy the livelihoods of Canadian workers for political theater." Let those words sit for a moment. A sitting prime minister using the words reckless and political theater to describe the actions of the President of the United States on national television, in front of the entire world. That is not diplomatic language. That is a declaration. And then he announced what came next. And this is where it gets genuinely extraordinary. Carney invoked the Critical Infrastructure Protection Act, a rarely used piece of Canadian legislation that allows the federal government to immediately restrict or nationalize any resource deemed critical to Canadian national security. And what did Carney designate as critical infrastructure? Canadian energy exports to the United States. Canadian mineral resources that American technology companies depend on for semiconductor manufacturing, Canadian water resources in the Great Lakes corridor, and Canadian airspace and transportation corridors that American airlines and shipping companies use every single day to access Asian and European markets. Let me translate what that means in language the Trump administration apparently needed explained to them. Carney just put his hand on the off switch for a significant portion of the American economy, and he made it very clear that if Trump follows through with Section 301 tariffs, Canada is prepared to flip that switch. Now let's talk about energy, because this is where the strategic miscalculation by the Trump administration becomes almost incomprehensible to anyone who has actually looked at the numbers. Canada supplies approximately 4 million barrels of oil per day to the United States, 4 million barrels every single day. That represents roughly half of all American oil imports. The entire northeastern United States, the industrial Midwest, the Pacific Northwest, these regions do not have a backup plan for Canadian energy. The infrastructure doesn't exist. The pipelines run in one direction. The refineries are configured specifically for Canadian crude. You cannot redirect that supply chain in days or weeks or even months. It would take years and hundreds of billions of dollars in infrastructure investment that simply has not been made and cannot be made on any timeline that matters politically. Trump walked into this fight thinking that American domestic oil production gave him leverage over Canada. What he apparently failed to understand is that American domestic production and Canadian imports serve different geographic markets and different refinery configurations. They are not interchangeable. They are not substitutes. You cannot tell a refinery in Michigan that was built to process Canadian heavy crude to switch overnight to Texas light crude. The machinery isn't designed for it. The economics don't support it. The logistics make it impossible on any relevant time frame. So when Carney announced that Canadian energy exports would be subject to immediate review and potential restriction, he wasn't bluffing. He was pointing a loaded weapon at the American energy supply and calmly explaining what would happen if Trump pulled the trigger first. The markets understood exactly what he was saying. Within 3 hours of Carney's address, oil futures jumped sharply. Natural gas futures climbed. American utility companies began issuing warnings about potential supply disruptions. And governors, not Democratic governors making partisan attacks, but governors of states that actually depend on Canadian energy to keep factories running and homes heated, started making phone calls to the White House that I imagine were not pleasant conversations. But energy is only the first domino. The second element of Carney's counteroffensive targets something that most Americans genuinely don't know about, but that keeps Pentagon officials awake at night. Critical minerals. Canada is one of the world's most significant producers of the minerals that modern technology cannot function without. Lithium for electric vehicle batteries, cobalt for consumer electronics, rare earth elements that go into everything from smartphones to precision-guided military munitions, potash for the fertilizers that American agriculture depends on to produce food for this country. These are not commodities that the United States can simply source elsewhere on short notice. The global supply chains for critical minerals are complex, long-established, and deeply integrated with Canadian production in ways that took decades to build and cannot be rebuilt quickly. And here is the detail that turned what was already a serious economic situation into a genuine national security crisis. The American military-industrial complex, the weapons manufacturers, the defense contractors, the aerospace companies that build the systems the American military depends on, is structurally dependent on Canadian mineral supply chains in ways that even many defense analysts didn't fully appreciate until Carney's announcement forced everyone to actually look at the numbers. There are credible, well-sourced reports that officials at the highest levels of the Defense Department have been in emergency sessions since Carney's announcement, scrambling to figure out how to brief the White House on a problem that the White House itself created. Because in Trump's rush to punish Canada over dairy quotas and digital services taxes, his trade team apparently failed to run the analysis on what a Canadian counteroffensive targeting mineral exports would actually do to American defense production capacity. That is not a minor oversight. That is a catastrophic failure of basic due diligence by people whose job is to anticipate exactly these kinds of consequences. Now, let me explain why the legal basis for Section 301 against Canada is so extraordinarily weak, because this matters enormously for understanding where this ends. Section 301 is supposed to be used against countries engaged in genuinely unfair trade practices, practices that violate international norms and discriminate specifically against American goods. The practices Trump is targeting in Canada do not meet that standard by any reasonable analysis. Canadian digital services taxes are structured similarly to taxes that exist in dozens of countries, including many of America's closest European allies. Canadian dairy policies are protectionist, yes, but they are consistent with WTO rules and have been reviewed and validated by international trade bodies for decades. Canadian environmental regulations are a straightforward expression of Canadian sovereignty over Canadian territory. Trade lawyers, including conservative trade lawyers and lawyers who served in Republican administrations, are nearly unanimous in their assessment that the Section 301 case against Canada cannot survive international legal scrutiny. The legal foundations simply are not there, which means that eventually, after years of WTO litigation and international arbitration, the United States is going to lose this case. And all the economic damage caused in the meantime will have been entirely self-inflicted. But Trump doesn't care about winning the legal case. He cares about the political messaging. He wants to be able to stand at rallies and tell his base that he's being tough on Canada, that he's fighting for American workers, that he refuses to let foreign countries take advantage of the United States. The fact that Canada is not taking advantage of the United States and that this trade relationship has been broadly balanced and mutually beneficial for decades is completely irrelevant to that calculation. The truth doesn't matter. The economic data doesn't matter. What matters is the narrative. And that is precisely what makes this situation so dangerous, because you cannot negotiate with someone who doesn't care about outcomes. You cannot find compromise with someone whose goal is performance rather than resolution. Carney understands this completely, which is why his response has not been to offer concessions or seek middle ground. It has been to build leverage, real, structural, unavoidable leverage that doesn't depend on Trump's rationality or goodwill or negotiating consistency. Let's talk about what Carney has actually built over the past several months, because this is the most underreported and most consequential part of this entire story. While Trump was tweeting threats and imposing tariffs and calling Canada a trade cheater at rallies, Carney was quietly and methodically constructing an alternative economic architecture. Comprehensive trade arrangements with the European Union, direct bilateral agreements with Japan and South Korea, a strategic framework for redirecting Canadian resource exports toward Asian markets, new long-term contracts with buyers in countries that are not subject to American trade policy volatility and cannot be pressured by Washington. Economists who have analyzed these arrangements estimate that Canada could reduce its trade dependency on the United States by 30 to 40% over the next 2 years, if these agreements are fully implemented. 30 to 40%. That is not a marginal adjustment at the edges. That is a fundamental restructuring of the Canadian economy away from dependency on an unreliable American partner. Warren Buffett noticed what was happening. In an interview that received far less attention in the American press than it deserved, Buffett said that when you have a trade relationship that has worked for 75 years and you decide to blow it up based on impulse and incomplete information, the market teaches you lessons. Expensive lessons. He was not talking about Canada learning a lesson. He was talking about the United States. American companies that built their entire supply chains around the assumption of stable, tariff-free access to Canadian inputs are now facing disruptions that are costing them real money right now. The construction industry is facing significant material cost increases because Canadian lumber is being redirected to Asian markets at better prices. Automotive manufacturers are dealing with parts shortages because Canadian auto component suppliers are shifting production capacity toward longer-term European contracts. Pharmaceutical companies are reporting supply constraints on generic medications because Canadian producers are prioritizing domestic use and EU export commitments over American orders. These are not abstractions. These are real disruptions hitting real American businesses right now, and they are going to get significantly worse before they get better. So where does this go from here? Let me be direct with you because the situation demands it. The best case scenario is that the economic pain becomes severe enough, fast enough, that the business community and enough Republican senators force a course correction before the July 2026 CUSMA review deadline arrives. That Trump finds a face-saving formulation to back down, declares victory, blames someone else, moves on to the next distraction, and Canada accepts the de-escalation without making it worse. I want to be completely honest about how likely that best-case scenario actually is. Trump does not back down. His entire political identity is constructed around the image of a man who never concedes, never admits error, never lets an opponent get the better of him. The psychological and political barriers to de-escalation on his side are enormous. The more probable scenario is continued escalation. Section 301 tariffs get implemented in full. Canada responds with the countermeasures Carney has already prepared and publicly signaled. American consumers watch prices rise sharply on a wide range of goods they depend on every week. American businesses in exposed sectors start cutting workers because input costs have become unmanageable. And Trump, rather than absorbing the political cost of changing course, responds by escalating further, because escalation is the only tool he has ever reliably reached for. If you are Canadian watching this, here is what your Prime Minister is actually doing and why it matters. He is not being reckless. He is not gambling with your economy out of stubbornness or political pride. He has made a cold, analytical calculation that the cost of standing firm right now, the tariff pain, the trade disruption, the investment uncertainty, is lower than the cost of capitulating to an administration that has demonstrated repeatedly that it will treat every concession as an invitation to demand more. He is betting that Canada's leverage is real and structural and unavoidable. He is betting that the economic pain is far more symmetrical than Trump assumed when he started this fight. And he is betting that time is on Canada's side because July 2026 is coming regardless of what Washington does, and every day without a negotiated resolution is a day that makes Canadian alternatives more concrete and American leverage less credible. If you are American watching this, your government is not protecting you. It is not fighting for American workers. It is not defending American economic interests. It is conducting an ego-driven campaign against your closest ally that is making your daily life more expensive, making American businesses less competitive globally, making American national security more vulnerable than it was 6 months ago, and making America less trusted and less influential in every corner of the world that matters. You deserve a government that does far better than this. Your workers deserve far better. July 2026 is coming. With less than 4 months until the CUSMA review deadline, nobody in Washington has a plan.